Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be listening to us from. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we ask you to question the dominant paradigm, or, as Benjamin Franklin said, question authority. That's the responsibility of every good patriot. Now, before I begin with tonight's very exciting show, I just encourage people to check out my website at michaelcross.net. Okay, tonight we have brought in a guest. He was here last week, and that is Professor Brian Anse Patrick, who's going to talk to us not about zombies, but about his other book, The 10 Commandments of Propaganda. Hello, Brian.
Michael, how are you?
Oh, very good, very good. So, I was noticing something here. You have the book's called The 10 Commandments of Propaganda, but you have 11 commandments here. What's with that?
It's a propagandistic trick. One of the commandments of propaganda is that you have to reflect or echo things that are already in people's minds. Otherwise, it's like you're trying to do an entire installation of new ideas. This is very difficult. But by referring to things that people already believe or value or cliches and so on, they already have space in their minds for this, and they become much more receptive to your ideas. So as a reader, that if I say, here's the 10 Commandments of Propaganda, you're going to get something that's like a bunch of schultz and schult knots, sort of a guide, precepts of behavior and so on, what you should and shouldn't do. And you're already prepared to accept this idea. It makes my work as an author much easier. You've kind of, you're ready. Let's put it that way.
And then you tie it together with what most people would consider an icon, that being the 10 Commandments.
Exactly. And I mentioned 11. I probably could have thrown a few extras in. I mean, that's the nice thing about these, the psychologists call them schema. They're kind of like these mental files we have on things. So you take advantage of pre-existent schema. Okay.
And before we start, because I thought what we could just do is go through your 11 commandments and share your insights. But before we get started, do you think it's safe to say that if you do not understand propaganda, the propagandist understands you and is best able to manipulate you?
Oh, exactly. I make it a point when I introduce my book that this is necessary for offense and defense if you're going to live a good life, an intelligent life. We're being worked. Most of what many people have in their heads is just it's not ideas. They're just the remnants of various propaganda campaigns. So yeah, you need to know these techniques. You need to recognize them when they're being used, and they're used constantly because propaganda is probably the dominant social management tool of our times.
Yeah, I mean, Edward Bernays said exactly what you said there. And most people have never even heard of Edward Bernays. They could go through high school and most majors in college and never hear of Edward Bernays. But hi there, we got cut off for a second.
Okay.
But no, most people have never heard of Edward Bernays, but he's the father of modern advertising and public relations.
Oh, very much so. And he also wrote books with the term propaganda in the title. He was known for a very bad pun. He was a member of the Committee on Public Information he worked for them in the First World War, which was the American Ministry of Propaganda, for lack of a better term. And he refers to what he did on the American side as propaganda, and he says what the people on the other side did was impropaganda. But he was definitely the guy who set down many of the paradigms of public relations and propaganda. In fact, Bernays taught the first course in public relations at New York University. He seems to have invented the term public relations.
Yeah, and the thing is that, he borrowed from a lot of his uncle Sigmund Freud's works and just basically said, hey, if this is the insights that Freud has on people's subconscious, why not just use them to throw a hook into them and then sell them things accordingly?
Oh, yeah. You got to be careful of Bernays' claims because Bernays was a brilliant propagandist, so you never know if he's propagandizing for himself or others. And I don't really believe some of his claims that, he used to listen to discussions about Sigmund Freud at the table when he was a child. But he was responsible for selling Freud in America. He was the guy who hawked the translations of Freud and made psychoanalysis like popular in America way before it ever became popular in Europe, where it was kind of discredited in Europe. But here it became very popular, and Freud too, largely because of Bernays.
Yeah, and one last thing before we get to the 11 Commandments, there is that propaganda itself is not. I think a lot of people believe that propaganda is lies, and in actuality, propaganda is not necessarily a lie. It's just a directed truth.
I call it a selected truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very popular misconception. And people think that propaganda needs to be some kind of obvious lie. You got to have some guy in a leather trench coat with a swastika on his armband talking to you. And this is not true at all. Propaganda has certainly used lies, and no doubt will use lies again. But a propagandist caught lying is discredited. What propaganda uses is carefully selected stories made up of scientific truths, things that people believe, facts, and so on. And what the propagandist really does, he's like connecting the dots. Those little table mats they give children in restaurants and so on, where you connect the dots. Well, that's what the propagandist does. He just draws a picture for people, and then they think they see it out there in reality. The propagandist is it's a scientifically informed art, not crude in any sense, although it can be done crudely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's just, without going into more detail, let's go through these things. Your first statement or commandment here is control the flow of information. What do you mean by that in American culture today?
Control the flow is first because it's probably the most vital. If a propagandist, if you could control the flow of information, you might not have to do anything else, because the only information out there is your information. And I'll give you that's why we censor. That's why censorship is attempted and so on, to prevent unwanted information from coming into play. But I'll give you a wonderful example. The British did this in the First World War. As you know, the British wanted the Americans in the war, and they needed it for economic purposes, for production purposes, and they would have lost the war, certainly, had America not come in eventually. So there was a lot of British effort to bring America into the war. Now, when hostilities started in the First World War in 1914, the first thing the British do is they send their Navy out and they cut the transatlantic cable. So suddenly, news is not going to New York anymore from Germany. New York is receiving news from Britain. And if you start looking at the New York Times after that, you'll find about 95% of the war news comes out of Britain and very little comes out of Germany. They dominated the conversation, and it worked out for them. They did other things as well. But yeah, control the flow is one of the best things you can do. And we've all worked in modern bureaucracies. Really another way of looking at a bureaucracy is just a kind of an organizational structure that selects and controls for the flow of information up and down, channels of reporting and things like that. Bureaucracies work through controlled information flow. It's very basic and often works well.
And nowadays, we only have 6 major corporations control like 95% of all both news information and TV programs even.
Oh yeah, and you don't have to get too conspiratorially minded to explain a lot of modern content, because the purpose of mass media, they may be to control, but they're also to make money. And it's a lowest common denominator type thing, which explains primetime TV and so on. Mm-hmm. Just when you think the lowest common denominator couldn't get any lower, it's like this big game of limbo. They lower the bar, and it's lower yet. How low can we go? But there's this tendency of corporate interests do what's in their best interest. That's almost the definition of a corporate interest. And you see less and less information. They do it in education. Where I work, it's this is a leftist bastion, and the information is selected to present leftist points of view. Many of my students are unaware that there are any other types of point of view or any other way of examining history and so on. So yeah, controlling the flow is a very effective way of controlling people, controlling the flow of information, because people can't imagine the alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I see things, for instance, that say that I've seen actually educational seminars in which a presentation's given, and it makes it sound as if when the Pilgrims arrived, the first thing they did was just go out and just start shooting American Indians, and it resulted in all the, basically clearing out the continent.
Oh, sure.
If you then, that gives an impression. It gives the impression of, oh my gosh, these people are really horrible. But at the same time, if you ignore the fact that actually what happened was smallpox, cholera, measles, and diseases they didn't have an immunity to, that Europeans and Africans had built up an immunity to over centuries, that's what, decimated the villages around America. It wasn't like this giant army just descending upon the tribes, but it gives an impression. And I've talked to so many people that believe it really was, this big army just going out and ethnically cleansing the entire countryside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the early settlers weren't that, even if they wanted to do that, they weren't that efficient. They had enough trouble hanging on to their own little lives and so on. A lot of those people starved out initially. They weren't exactly practicing genocidal warfare.
Yeah, but if you present it a certain way, you can make it sound as if they did.
Well, Marxism has this notion of what they call in history nomothetic laws. There are certain laws of history. And Marxism believes that progress history proceeds by means of class warfare. And so, therefore, everything is interpreted according to class warfare by Marxist historians, and there is no alternative view to history. It's always the weak being destroyed, but then the weak rising up and forming a new society based on the wonderful principles of socialism. It's always the same game, same dance, different tune sometimes, but it's always the same.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like a religion.
It is. Marx has been called a prophet by various people.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go on here. Now you have something interesting here. Reflect the values and beliefs of the audience.
Yes, this is why I called the book The 10 Commandments of Propaganda when there's really 11. You've got to use what's already in there to be effective. Propagandists are often, they do long-term stuff, but those are like sort of propagandas of socialization. They're difficult to install. They take many years and so on. But if you're working in more pragmatically in short terms, you can't install all these ideas. So let me take one very famous example. And Adolf Hitler, anti-Semitism. The reason Adolf Hitler and Nazism used anti-Semitism, why it was convenient for them, because the Germans already were anti-Semitic. People think that, my students think Hitler suddenly creates anti-Semitism one afternoon in 1925 or something. This is not true. The Germans were, like Richard Wagner, for example. I mean, he was a virulent anti-Semite, and he's like a proto-Nazi. Martin Luther was anti-Semitic in the sense. He wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies. There were a lot of folklore and so on about the Jews. English folklore too. The story of like little William is out to play, and his mother finds him dying, and she says, "What happened to you?" And he says, "The Jew wife hath me slain." Because there were, all these stories about Passover sacrifices of Christian children, and the Jews were strange and they were outlandish in a literal sense of the word, from the outlands. So yeah, the Jews were highly suspect. So Hitler just simply pounds on this old theme and refines it a little bit, focuses a little bit, and so on. In fact, when the Germans were making films in 1940, they made a film called The Eternal Jew, which was sort of a historical explanation of world Jewry as they saw it. They did it because they saw that the Germans were, quote unquote, insufficiently anti-Semitic, and that the French and the Poles were a lot more anti-Semitic, and the Germans had to sort of catch up. So they use what's already out there.
Okay, so would this sort of be like examples like in Latin America when they've tried to get birth control campaigns going? You find maybe a priest who agrees with you, and then you build him up and stuff so that it looks like your message is a message that reflects the values of a Catholic society.
Oh, certainly. That's why you select your symbols and so on, your symbolic figures in your campaigns and so on, people who resonate with the values and so on. If you send a guy in there with a surgical mask on and a white coat, he's not going to get so far as the priest did. I mean, there's going to be resistance. So you got to figure out what people already believe. And they learned early on in a lot of these worldwide communication campaigns. I'm talking back in the 1940s, 1950s, after that they were these campaigns were foolish. They were trying to preach birth control to people who regarded children as a gift from God. So the more children you have, the more God loved you. So why would such a person want to practice birth control? So a lot of these campaigns were ridiculous failures because they did not align sufficiently with the beliefs of the people.
Okay, and then they they went back and they changed it.
Pardon me, you broke up.
Oh, okay. So then what they did was they just went back and changed it to try to at least present themselves as reflecting the values of the society, and they were successful.
Yeah, exactly. And you use like established spokespersons, community respected elders, work with the priests, stuff like that. So at least it came in, under their defensive thresholds. But in American politics, you see this a lot. For example, one of the big themes of American politics is in recent years has been this notion of the declining middle class, and the middle class is in trouble and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I know you're familiar with this. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, well, where did these people ever get the idea they were middle class in the first place? Very few people are middle class in the old traditional sense of the word. I mean, middle class people were capitalists. They were entrepreneurs. They were venture capitalists. They were bankers, mercantile types, and so on. All these people are really working class, and since about the time of the Second World War, it's become popular for people who work in cubicles and who shovel information instead of shit to regard themselves as middle class. But it's not true. But this is a very treasured belief, though, because in America, people believe in upward mobility. I'm an individual. I really matter. I can work myself. I can work my way to the top and all this kind of stuff. So you have to talk about this in politics. And you have to tell them, well, your middle-class status is threatened. Well, actually, their middle-class status is imaginary, but they don't want to hear this either. But you notice how this idea resonates with what people believe about themselves. It's very important.
Okay, quite interesting there. Well, let's go on. Then this is something I'm not sure even what this means. Disambiguate?
Oh, I love that word. Yeah, I crammed that together, and my spell check didn't like it either. Disambiguate means to make less ambiguous. Propaganda does not thrive in the gray zone, if you know what I mean. You're not looking at a sociology lecture here, which discusses the 100 factors that affect the modern political system. Instead, you do like Adolf Hitler. You say it's the Jews, and the Jews are attacking us, Aryan society. You've taken 1,000 economic factors and simplified them into this us versus them thing. This is what I mean by making less ambiguous or disambiguate. And you've got to do this in propaganda because most people are simple. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to be simple, but they're not into this depth of explanation and so on. So you got to tell them a story. It's like, so we hear these cartoon stories. And of course, you already mentioned one earlier in the show. The fact that these people are learning that the Americans, settlers arrived in the Americans and just started this genocidal war. And that suddenly becomes history. And that's all they know. It's a cartoon history. It's a disambiguated history. And almost every big social movement has its own disambiguated cartoon history. The Nazis had this view of the Aryan versus the mud peoples and the under people. You know, the Aryans were the civilizing races. If you're a communist, a Marxist, you believe they're on some kind of progressive choo-choo train of history, and these laws of history are propelling you forward, and everyone else is a counter-revolutionary or a capitalist. You know, it's another disambiguated thing. If you're a labor union guy, you believe it's us versus management. If you're a feminist, something like that, you believe it's patriarchy versus, you know, the women's movement and so on. So these are very essential things to mobilize people. They gives people orientation, gives people meaning. I mentioned earlier the German film The Eternal Jew. which was a very long film by modern standards. I believe modern people don't have attention spans like people did in 1930, 1940, because those people used to read. And the film Eternal Jew is set up. It's very, very long, and it's almost like a book on film. And a person's not going to come out, your average viewer is not going to come out of that film remembering 1,000 facts. He's going to come out remembering this cartoon history that the Nazis presented him with, which is essentially, look at these Jews, they're a problem. They're like a public health problem. They're always been a plague, and they continue to be the plague. And we hard-working Germans, we work hard, and they don't work. That's the entire summation of a 2-hour-long movie. But and it's cartoon history. Mm-hmm. Disambiguation needs to be done. Now look at Bernie Sanders. I mean, it's the rich. It's the 2%. It's all the rest of us against the 2%. Now, if you're so naive as to believe that crap, that means you're 21 years old, maybe. But it's a ridiculous simplification, but for propagandistic purposes, it's probably a necessary simplification.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I think all the political campaigns are based on this because if you take a look at Hillary's support in Iowa, it came mostly from elderly white women who were probably in their 20s and 30s during when the feminist movement kind of got rolling. Mm-hmm. And now they see electing Hillary, even if they disagree with her on issues, it's symbolic.
She's a powerful woman.
Yes, it's a woman.
I see a lot of that. They like her because she's seen as the powerful woman.
Yes.
Now, personally, if that's the powerful woman, God help us all. But I think there are powerful women of many other sorts, thankfully.
Yeah.
But this is the cartoon.
Yeah, and on the other side, you're hearing me, right?
Oh, I hear you well.
Okay, good. I was just checking here. My counter was, for some reason, not registering. On the other side, though, Bernie Sanders' support came from under 30 white males, which I believe it wasn't Gloria Steinem, feminist. She recently kind of took some flack because she said maybe many women are kind of in the Bernie campaign because they want to meet guys or something like that.
That's probably a better reason than voting for Bernie.
Yeah, but I'm thinking these under 30 guys, they're probably, their view of life to a large degree is shaped by comedians. I mean, you've got Jon Stewart, you've got Colbert, you have all these kinds of guys, and that's where they're getting their information. So this is kind of their social clique that where they're getting their motivations from, I think.
Oh, yeah, and let's call it their orientation, because that's what it is. It's the orientation to the world. They see the world in these terms. That's where it's the world came from here, and here's where it is, and the solution becomes, once you buy this kind of orientation, for example, let's go back to the Eternal Jew, that the Jews are the problem. Nowhere in the Eternal Jew does it ever say, let's kill the Jews. There's no mention of this. But after you saw this film and somebody said, well, should we kill the Jews? And you might say, why not? I mean, that's once you get someone in this cartoon, the cartoon controls them. I mean, it explains the world for them. They're very powerful, simple ideas. For an idea to be powerful, it has to be simple. It has to transmit to many people. It has to be widely shared. I've got a student in one of my classes this semester, and the classes have only going on for 5 weeks or something like that. So I don't know this guy well, but he's a young person and he's kind of has these socialistic ideas, and I think all his previous professors have been like this. But he's very thoughtful, and all I can really and he comes up with these us versus them kind of scenarios, these typical leftist kind of explanations of events in history and U.S. policies. And he says, Western society is really bad and all this kind of stuff. And I tell him, listen, Western society is the only thing that's ever worked as far as I can tell. And it's produced ideas of freedom and liberty and all this kind of stuff. You're making these accusations within the context of Western history. They wouldn't be possible otherwise. But you can bring some of these people along. I say, try reading this book. Look at this. And I can see he's stretching a little bit. But for the most part, people are content with the cartoon. Because this is another principle of propaganda we'll go into later. I mean, we'll talk about this later. But people, you need to give them this kind of psychological orientation, and you fill their spiritual, social needs so they kind of understand the world and they feel content with themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's some things I want to add there, but let's just go on here.
Go ahead.
Number 4, use group pressure to horizontally shape beliefs and behavior.
Yeah. Now, this is something that most people don't think of as propaganda. But since about the time of the Second World War, there's been a lot of social scientific effort spent on propaganda. The U.S. government funded many, many, many studies. And here's the deal. If you want to change attitudes, you can do so through education campaigns. You can teach people things like, smoking is bad. And if you repetition and simplicity, you'll get a lot of people who will, they'll be able to recite the mantra, smoking, secondhand smoke, and smoking causes this and that. And they'll be able to give you a lot of reasons. And if you ask them, like in a survey question, well, how do you feel about smoking? They say, smoking is bad. So you've changed their attitudes, perhaps. But do they actually stop smoking? This is a good question. And often they don't. Behaviors are very different than attitudes, and they're hard to change. The thing about groups is you can use groups to change attitudes and behaviors. Group pressure is much more effective than mere information. So if you can put people in these group situations where they discuss and they have what they call the normative powers of groups, the shaping, like the pressure vessel or the vessel, the pressure pot kind of effects of groups on them, they tend to change more. So you see the modern trend in corporate management has been towards the use of groups, team management, committees, assigning people on these what so-called employee participation things, quality control groups, and it's very effective. You also get rid of layers of, the traditional organization is kind of a bureaucratic pyramid, kind of steep, and you have all this middle management that costs a lot of goddamn money to keep around. Research shows pretty clearly that if you flatten the pyramid, get rid of middle management, and put people in these self-managed groups with minimal supervision and so on, but still directives from above, they actually are much more productive. Their behavior changes much better. So this is the direction. It's a very important direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you said, I think a lot of the reason why you don't see a lot of smoking, especially amongst younger people who are, they're the ones planning on going to college or they're in college, is more of a group thing. People would look at them like, what are you doing, smoking, or something like that.
And there's peer group thing, but there's also small groups. But, most students in America, at least I don't know about the rural areas, but in the urban areas, have been through what's called DARE programs. DARE is some kind of acronym, the meaning of which I'm not sure of, but it's some kind of anti-drug whatever program. And one of the standard things that they do in these things is they put these students, and these are elementary school students usually, they put them in small groups and they have them play act, do role-playing exercises about how to resist drug deals and things like that. And these things are very effective. Any kind of group situation like this works. In fact, in the Marxist, communist-style revolutions, they're entirely, at the local level, they're entirely small groups. People are assigned to little committees and neighborhood committees and stuff, and production committees and factory committees under the guidance of a political officer who leads the discussions. And that's how you control people. Instead of the old-fashioned way of social control is, you'd have a supervisor, and he'd control a number of people, 10, 20, 30, 50. Nowadays, you put someone in a group with 12, 15 people, and he has 12 or 15 supervisors, all his fellow group members. It's a very ingenious way to work. Group therapy looks like this, too.
Or what they used to call in the 60s the policeman in your head.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's the basic idea of propaganda.
Yeah, control the person's thoughts. And that probably relates to number 5 here, cognitively penetrate and stick.
Yeah, cognitive penetration is simply getting somebody's attention. And, when you think about the nature of modern world in the West, we are bombarded with information. We live in a cloud of noise. And it gets harder and harder to get someone's attention. You're really asking for a lot. Hey, read my book. Look at my idea. Listen to me. When you have, you're competing with the Kardashians' butts. You're competing with the Super Bowl. You're competing with 1,000 things. So how do you get people's attention? And this is usually what we think of as advertising. How do you get that 10 seconds of attention from someone? And there are many ways to do this. Sex appeal, novelty, appeals of salience, like things like this is going to affect your pocket. You're paying for this. Sometimes it's just by speaking loudly. As you well know, if you watch television, the advertisements are always louder than the programming, and that's quite by design. They want to yell at you. They're paying to do this, and they want access to that audience of that. The advertisers want access to that audience of that particular program. So yeah, there's a lot of ways of doing this, and sometimes you use like rhyme, lyrics, music. Again, you see all this ingenuity that goes into advertising, and that's really what they're trying to do: cognitively penetrate, and also to get people to remember a little bit. Sometimes, and this is an old basic. I think even Hitler talks about this. The basic is simplicity and repetition. Just keep pounding it in. How many slogans does any one person have in their head? Where do you have it your way? There's 1,000 slogans that we could probably identify if I had a list of them, because they've been pounded into our heads through repetition.
Mm-hmm.
So, this kind of stuff works. It's very necessary, and it's not going away. I mean, it gets more difficult all the time in some ways. But I'll tell you another thing. Sometimes the way to get people's attention is that you whisper, if you know what I mean, because everybody else is screaming.
Yeah, I've actually used that technique in classes where you're dealing with a really boring subject and you go on like an hour of lecture, and then you just see people are zoned out, and then you just start talking really low, and all of a sudden they're like, hey, what's going on? And then they start listening.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do it, and a lot of it has to do with novelty. It's one of the reasons why if you do Facebook or anything like that, I notice these pleas for attention in Facebook, which consist of like 13 bra sizes of celebrities, all sorts of stuff, gruesome photos of whatever, stuff, things that just kind of the morbid or the sexy or the interesting things that flash by and get people's attention. And of course, what they're really aiming at is to connect you with their advertisers. It's a simple principle, but not always easy to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's you have to you've got to break through the brush, or you're never going to hit your target. Well, let's go in here so we have time.
Let me ask you one example. Did you notice the cover of my book?
Yes, kind of like the idea I got when I first saw it was like the Oracle of Delphi, or that you kind of mix that with the Ten Commandments archetype.
Yeah. And it's a young woman, attractive young woman in a gauzy little filament kind of thing, holding up this Ten Commandment thing, like very, and there's a reason why my picture is not on the cover of that book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, leave that alone.
I've noticed that on videos and articles I've done, that if you have something that's either kind of creepy or it's a picture of a model, then get way more views and longer.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. So I can't imagine.
Are you there? Okay, I missed your last statement. Our Skype went out again.
Oh, I said the effect of I'm figuring out the cover of my next book, because my next one is going to be about propaganda. It's going to be strictly about gun control propagandists. But I'm trying to figure out some way to work sex into the cover. I haven't figured this out yet, but I will.
Well, there's a lot of Facebook pictures. I think there's a whole Facebook groups of pictures with girls with guns and stuff like that. So it probably wouldn't be that difficult.
I hope it's not, because I want this. I don't want to reach too far. I used a line one time at a conference that I got an ovation for. It was a gun rights conference, and it was the only thing I like better than a good-looking woman. It's a good-looking woman with a gun. So.
Yeah.
But anyway,
and
maybe that's the way to go.
And you can tie that in with empowerment, even.
I'm surprised the feminists haven't done that. I am amazed how gun resistant they are.
Yeah, I think it's because I think they look at it in a paradigm that if they look at a gun show, they see a lot of middle class, working class males at gun shows.
Yeah, evil white males.
Yeah,
that's true. And they're also collectivists. I mean, And that's a different way of looking at the world, very much so. The state holds all power and so on, and then the state dribbles out rights to people and so on. Yeah.
Okay, well, we got to get going here if we're going to get through all these.
Okay.
Distance the propaganda from its source.
Okay, what this refers to is that the propagandist. Okay, you've heard the expression, whoever represents himself has a fool for an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
Well, propaganda is much the same way. If the White House is speaking, you know what the White House wants. You can their motives become transparent. If a press release comes out of the National Rifle Association, you know what it's going to say before you even read it. If a press release comes out of Brady Center for Control Violence or whatever they call it nowadays, you know what it's going to say before you even read it. So what they do is they tend to put out information through sources, the credibility of which is unknown. So you have these citizens committees for fill in blank that come out of the woodwork around elections. Now, you don't know who these people are sometimes, or veterans for Swift Current, if you remember that one. And so on. So you create these front groups, organizations that release information that you don't really know how to write off in advance. So people listen to it a little bit more. They seem more credible in these politically charged atmospheres.
Is that sort of like when large pharmaceutical companies will set up web pages, but they'll call it Citizens for Children's Excellence or something like that?
Exactly. Or Bloomberg does, there's like citizens committees, every man, every town for gun safety. That's how Bloomberg stuff funded and so on. Mm-hmm. Or, we talked about Ed Bernays before. He was a big proponent of this method. And he used to do things like, I'll give you an example. He sold the banana to the American Republic, of the American people, because before about 1920-ish or so, banana was pretty much a comic fruit. When he started working for the United Fruit Company, he got some whacked out paper from some whacked out doctor about the benefits of bananas on infant digestion. And he had this thing printed by the hundreds of copies sent to magazines, and he created this organization with some name like Physicians for Infant Digestion. So it became this front organization essentially sells the idea of the banana, which became a staple food. It's a pretty simple technique, but it's very effective because, again, as a consumer of information, how are you going to process all this? You're not a detective. Who's got time to run all these things down and see where they come from? But you do need to be vigilant and check out sources.
Very interesting indeed. Accommodate informational needs and habits.
This is, if you want to go deer hunting, if you want to shoot a deer, you should find where the deer are. I've learned this in life. If you want to get to consumers and so on, you want to get to working class people who are professionals, well, maybe you put your ad on the subway, or maybe you find the channels they watch. You got to figure out what they want and need, and you can kind of ambush them with information in strategic spots. I knew these guys at Michigan, University of Michigan years ago, a couple of Jewish kids. They were from New York, and they were graduating, and they were going home, and they started this remarkable business, which they went out and they leased the space in men's rooms above the urinals, and then they sold advertisements on them. I mean, this is brilliantly simple. Mm-hmm. But, you have this poor man at the urinal staring at the wall 10 inches in front of him, and there's an advertisement now that these guys put up. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's accommodating informational needs and habits. Or, even more importantly, is learning what journalists need. Journalists are a lot like my journalistic friends hate me when I say this, but really, American journalism is more like farmer Old MacDonald's farm, where, he has this trough and he feeds the pigs. Well, what American journalism has become is all the PR people, propagandists, have this trough, and they throw press releases and information in it, and the journalists come and feed at it. So you make it possible to give them pre-written content, easy access things, press releases, exciting visual events, film events, things like that. So you accommodate their needs to meet a deadline the next day or to get on the 6 p.m. news. And by doing this, you'll find if you look at the national news stream, it varies from day to day, but somewhere between 50 and about 80% of the news comes out of these public relations offices and official sources in the nature of this kind of accommodational information. So, you feed the pigs, they come and eat.
Yeah, and of course that's where the White House or, the large organizations, the Pentagon, they study this and they know exactly how to present their information to the public through the media.
Oh, they thrive on it. They work around this kind of stuff. I mean, they have many people on staff. You know, they can't. There's actually a federal budgetary statute or something that prevents the feds from employing public relations officers. So they call them things like community relations officers and so on. But there's tens of thousands of them.
Yeah, and even and a lot of people are unaware of the fact that the Pentagon, CIA, they're interested in fiction because that's public relations for their organizations.
Sure. Yeah, and you help certain authors, you release studies, you make it possible for your view, you grease the skids for your view to get out there. And you know, you have to feel sorry for journalists because they are working in a competitive deadline industry. Plus the news organizations themselves, that's a business. So whoever can do this, get out a newspaper with the least amount of expenses and the most amount of advertising is making the most money. Now, it costs a lot of money to do investigative reporting, and it takes a lot of time. It's a lot easier just to use press releases. They give it to you for free.
Yeah. And then you also make friends with the higher-ups, and you get to go to their parties.
Yeah. I wish I was friends with more higher-ups, to tell you the truth.
The number 8 here, address psychological, spiritual, and social needs.
Yeah. Now, this is a big, fuzzy area. But, you know, I'm going to quote from a preacher I heard one time. And he said, your average person is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex, which I thought was a funny line. But people need to feel important. They need to feel like they matter. If you get up in the morning and you don't know what life means, and you have this sense of angst and so on, maybe you're Michael Moore, I don't know. But, no, seriously, if you have no sense of orientation, if you don't feel like you're going anywhere, you can't survive like that. It's just not human. I mean, you have to belong to something, be somewhere. So a lot of propaganda makes people feel like they're part of a movement or part of some historical flow, some direction into the future. You're progressive. We're building a better future here. Or just that you're okay, I'm okay, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, you have to talk to people in these terms. Even making people believe they're middle class, you think of what this does for people and also what it does for the system. One of the things that the belief in middle classhood, which I think is largely false, one of the things that having this belief accomplishes is it gets a lot of nasty jobs done that otherwise people wouldn't want to do. They have hope or they feel like they have personal efficacy. Or you make them feel like, wow, you have a sense of duty, or you're part of the bigger whole, or we're going somewhere, or your children can grow up to be richer and stronger and better than you, and all this kind of stuff. Very important to give people that sense of orientation. The Nazis did it. You know, everybody does it.
We call those Horatio Alger stories.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, those were popular indeed. And, you know, even Bernie Sanders does it. I mean, we become part of this big hand-holding vision of America, and we're all in this together, and we're going to sing Kumbaya. And
or wait, what is that Coke commercial they had like around I remember when I was a little kid, they had the one where everyone's holding hands in a circle and they're singing about Coca-Cola.
Yeah, I do that all the time. No, this kind of stuff. Yeah, you got to make people feel like they're in part of something, like they mean something. And, you know, everybody in this, just about everybody in America thinks they're like some kind of astonishing individual, which is, yet everybody dresses alike, talks alike, looks alike, and reads the same newspapers. So somehow or other, you have in this mass society this weird notion like you really matter and you're the center of the world. It's an impossible paradox, but propaganda manages to pull it off. One of the best quotes I ever read on propaganda comes from a French writer named Jacques Ellul. It was well worth reading. And Ellul said, everything is explained thanks to propaganda. Because that's what it does. It gives you orientation.
Maybe that's why the military pays for flag displays and soldiers and stuff at football games now, and it makes everyone feel they're part of this big patriotic male bonding thing.
Well, you know, look at the Super Bowl the other day. That people were digging that national anthem thing. I've seldom seen a crowd that reacted quite like that. It seems to be the direction. You know, national unity. We're all in this together.
Okay, yeah, and that can be good and bad depending on who's taking that direction. Okay.
I'm kind of thinking that America may have ADD, and if anything ever breaks through that ADD, things will be all right. Like if anybody ever attracts America's attention, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. But for the most part, I think we're ADD as a nation.
Okay. Hey, number 9, personalize, I guess, and or dehumanize as appropriate.
Yeah. You notice recently President Obama is back on the NRA stuff as the evil gun lobby. I mean, the NRA is not an evil gun lobby. It's a citizens association of over 5 million people. The money comes from the people who belong to it. And what you do is you take people and you turn them into a machine or into a plague. The Nazis use terms like the Jewish bacillus and stuff like that. Or you do another thing. You portray them. Sometimes it's just name calling. I used to see this a lot in gun coverage in New York Times, especially when I'd read this stuff. And if they were covering, and they're very anti-gun and so on, and you can tell it in their coverage. If they were covering somebody like Sarah Brady, who was the wife of Jim Brady, the presidential aide who was wounded by Hinckley years ago, and if they were covering her, it was like they were covering some movie star. They would say things like, she lights up a room. She has a shining smile. She reminds you of Imogene Coco, and she's in a noble pursuit, this great advocate. If they're covering like an NRA spokesman, they would say something like, he was squinty and sweaty. I remember them one time talking about Tanya Mataxa, who was head of a major portion of NRA. She was a Institute for Legislative Action director, and she was a very formidable professional woman. And they described her coming into the room, and they said she's large-breasted and so on, and like bristling for a fight or something like this. I mean, they made her sound like some kind of female or something. And that's the kind of stuff they do. They do these dark psychological portraits. Look at how the Allied propaganda, U.S. and British propaganda, look what they did with Hitler and all those people in the Second World War. They made them seem like cartoon goons. And those guys might have been goons, but there was nothing funny about them. You destroy people in any way you can. You demonize them. You make them remove their endearing characteristics and so on. This is the oldest and naturalist thing we do. We sit down and we call people names. Mm-hmm. New York Times just does it a lot more eloquently than many of us do.
Well, I mean, even if you read an article nowadays, the big bad guy, if you read, the mainstream press is Russia. And what I find ironic is when Russia was communist, the media often was apologetic. And now they're not communist, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, they're the this huge, like, monstrous threat and everything.
And even like Putin, for example, I'm sure there are plenty of bad pictures of Obama to publish, but when they do a picture of Putin, they've got to do this thing with his bare-chested on a horse. So on. Any kind of negative portrayal, and that's you demonize, you depersonalize, you do whatever you can. And it's a lot easier to oppress a lobby than it is to oppress people. So that's why you call it the gun lobby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sticks in people's minds, which is kind of scary. But I've seen the way people will find a meme somewhere. These are so popular nowadays. No one knew what they were 6 years ago. I had a student that was like, would it be okay to do research on memes? And I'm like, what's a meme? And now they're like,
after you found out, you said, good topic.
Yeah. But now they're almost foundational in politics. But I hear people quote memes because I read these. I read social media. I've got children, so I'm getting the stuff on Facebook that they're sharing and things. And when I hear a student who's like 19 years old quoting a meme that I just saw on Facebook yesterday, I'm like, wait a minute. Do you have analytical abilities on this?
Yeah, but maybe it's the new literacy. I mean, the old literacy seems to be dying out, so maybe meme literacy is coming in.
Oh, my gosh, yeah. I mean, we'll have the meme version of War and Peace. It'll just be like a graphic novel 2 pages long. So.
I noticed that graphic novel section of the bookstore keeps growing.
Yeah, I've had people tell me that my books, a little plug here, Freedom from Conscience series, I had people tell me, you should make those into graphic novels. They'd be so awesome. And I'm like, I don't even know where to begin. I'm so traditional. I don't know where I would begin on trying to do that. But anyway, got to go on here for time here. Number 10, dispense truth, facts, logic, and science.
Yeah. If I use the example in the book, most of us, if we were sick today, we would go to a doctor. We wouldn't go to a priest. Now, some of us might go to a priest, but the idea is this is the age of science. We don't believe in oracles anymore. We believe science is going to save our butts from whatever the hell we're going, and we're all going there eventually. So yeah, people want scientific stuff, and they seem to remember this kind of stuff. It's the prestige way of communicating. But you also have to give people information, data sheets, reports. Like a lot of these white papers and so on that come out in political campaigns. I really doubt that anyone really seriously reads those things, but they're there as lists of facts or factoids. Everybody produces research to support their particular end. There's half a dozen think tanks that I can think of that produce either leftist or rightist research on, that are scientific economic studies of the following phenomenon and so on. So yeah, you produce science, and you present this kind of stuff, and that's regarded as proofs today. And it puts your average person at a great disadvantage because few of us are trained in scientific research methodology. Few people can actually tell you even if a survey is well-designed or not. And yet you were bombarded with this nonsense. The reporters are notoriously stupid about interpreting survey results and social scientific findings. For example, they think that a significant finding means it's a big finding, and all it means is it's not attributable to chance by statistics. So, this kind of stuff gets pushed into the news and it's presented like it's a higher form of truth or so on. So it's very important to use this kind of stuff. In the gun informational wars, you'll see that the anti-gun people produce a lot of nonsense. Johns Hopkins produces a lot of studies and so on. New England Journal of Medicine produces a lot of stuff. And I read this stuff, and most of it's crap. But how are you going to know that unless you've been to grad school at Michigan or something like that? I mean, even reading this stuff, it's couched in an armor-plated kind of conventional format. So it's beyond your average person who simply doesn't have that kind of time or attention span or desire to do this kind of stuff. So science, truth, it works. Pile it on.
And also to get a respectable. I mean, there's people out there that, I'm not going to name names, but there's people out there that everyone thinks is a credentialed scientist or a credentialed psychologist or psychiatrist or all these other things, and they quote them, but yet they don't realize that they're not. But yet the media presents them as if they are.
Oh yeah. It's who looks into these sources? I mean, who's to say if you got your degree from Bug Tussle University or from Harvard? And even Harvard is kind of suspect to me in some cases. I've read nonsense from there, too.
Yeah. Okay, finally, we've got about 5 minutes here. Demonstrate good ethics, but then you have in parentheses, don't get caught.
Yes. Okay, everybody. I think if you went back and looked at this speeches of Julius Caesar and stuff like this, who was, when he acquired the dictatorship and so on, everybody speaks in terms of the commonwealth. I'm doing this for the good of the common man and so on. So everything is done in this ethical pose. I mean, if you listen to Bernie, if you listen to Hillary, you listen to Stalin, listen to any of these guys, I mean, they speak in these high moral tones. You're doing this out of need, necessity, for the race, for the good of the people. It's always the people's republic of whatever. So yeah, you got to put yourself in this kind of position to be an effective propagandist. A part of it has to do with the old Aristotelian concept of ethos. I mean, to Aristotle, and he was right about this, I'm sure, part of being persuasive was to be fair and honest and well-intentioned and so on, a good person, of good humor and so on. So part of it is just doing this. A lot of did you watch the State of the Union? Many people did. I did.
I saw excerpts from it.
that was enough. But it's always the same game. You see the president, and he's dressed just so, and you see everybody there looking just so, and everybody is, they have these things they show them with their families before or after, and all this is part of an ethos thing to seem like you have a high ethical system, or you're a very ethical person, and so on. It's one of the most important things you do, because in absence of other information, we tend to make decisions about a person's credibility, their believability, based on who they are. I mean, I know you're a nice person, so you tell me something, I believe you. It's as simple as that. Who's got time to, I don't have a research staff at my disposal to verify everything you just said, but, in lieu of other information, I say, hey, he's a nice guy, he's sensible, he's a good guy, he shook my hand, looked me in the eye, he's a nice guy. Propagandists know this well, so a lot of time is spent on just this appearance of ethics. It's funny, if you look at the Public Relations Society of America, they have this elaborate code of ethics. It makes them seem like they're doing such wonderful things for humanity. And yet, behind it all, I think part of the reason you have a code of ethics is so somebody else doesn't come in there and regulate you. Regulate yourself, and you can defend yourself. Go, look, we have a code of ethics. So the first thing the sharks do, I'm sure the sharks and the barracudas have a code of ethics too that they would brandish if they were challenged.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like we said with when leaders make comments. I mean, Machiavelli, and if people don't know who Machiavelli is, they should look him up and learn a little bit about politics. But the thing is that he did say that a leader, he has to be willing to create a image of himself, or the people will not fall in line. So that's very important.
Oh, it's maybe more important than anything else you can produce.
Yeah, I always notice
I think
when Obama's in trouble, he always has lots of pictures with his family. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, but they're so nice.
I remember, I never actually attempted to scientifically verify this, but I remember back in the Bill Clinton days, whenever things got a little too wild and so on, Hillary would appear in a pink suit instead of a blue one. And because it probably made her look softer and more domestic. Mm-hmm. I always wondered if that was deliberate, and I suspect it may have been.
Well, defense attorneys, if they have a woman especially that has committed a horrendous crime, they'll dress her up like she's going to church, and so the jury will think, oh wow, this isn't this person. They'll do a disassociation. Anyway, in the remaining time we have, where can people get your book and find out more about you, or if they have some ideas for your next book cover with a gun or something?
If you're a woman with a gun who wants to be on the cover, yeah. Okay, all my books are available. Arctos Media publishes, I think, all of my books. Yeah, all of my books, as far as print goes, they're all available on Amazon. Amazon.com, they're all there. Same with e-books and so on. They're all on Amazon. If you want to contact me, brian.patrick@utoledo.edu. And I also have a blog, Rise of the Anti-Media, which you can find. And I put various articles and things like that are of interest to me. There's even technical articles on there on like reviewing 45 pistols and so on, things that I kind of enjoy and use.
Okay. Well, that sounds excellent. My gosh, this hour passed really fast here. Okay. Well, thank you again for coming on the show, and I'm sure I'm going to be sending you a notice in the future about more appearances.
Oh, I love it. Thank you, and it's always good to talk. And, at heart, I'm a troublemaker. I've always been a troublemaker. I started writing books because when I was a little kid, I used to throw rocks. Now I write books. Same principle.
That's good sublimation there. Okay, well, take care, and I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight for this edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.
My name is S.M. Gibson, and I am the host of Anti-Media Radio on UCY